This is Thomas Wayne Riley, and you have found yourself in the American Southwest. This is part 2 of my series on the explorer and spy, Zebulon Montgomery Pike. If all the route to Santa Fe should be of the same description in case of war, I would pledge my life, and what is infinitely dearer, my honor, for the successful march of a reasonable body of troops into the province of New Mexico. Zebulon Montgomery Pike, on October 2nd, 1806. Pike and his group, which now consisted of 2 officers, 1 doctor, 18 soldiers, 1 interpreter, and 3 Osage men and 1 woman, they all began again on their march towards the southwest on October 7th, 1806, after a tense farewell in the Pawnee camp of far southern Nebraska. Pretty quickly after leaving the Pawnee village, Pike and his entourage came across the camp and the trail that the large Spanish force had made when they left the same Pawnee village. This was fortuitous for Pike, because he figured the Spanish were using excellent guides who knew where water and timber for fires would be. Pike may have also hoped to catch up to the enormous group of Spaniards so that Pike could be captured and taken down to Santa Fe, and then shown what he in fact was desiring to see the whole time: Spanish military positions, forts, men-at-arms, the towns, just everything he could. Any information that would be helpful in the war with Spain that might be coming any day now. On the 9th, the crew ran into one of the Pawnee chiefs of the smaller village. This was Escorted, and with him was a third of his village. And for the second time in 3 days, a tense situation unfolded. At first, it was a friendly interaction, and the Indians gave Pike and his men some bear meat. But then the Americans discovered that one of these Pawnees had stolen Dr. Robinson's knife from his saddle. So, Pike, Robinson, and the interpreter Vasquez marched over to Escorted, and I will just quote Pike's journal. They, quote, went to the chief and demanded that he should cause a search to be made. It was done. But when the dirk was found, the possessor asserted that he had found it on the road. I told him that he did not speak the truth, and informed the chief that we never suffered a thing of ever so little value to be taken without liberty. End quote. So by now, the chief's people, a third of the village, they had surrounded the Americans. Pike wrote, quote, at this time the prairie was covered with his men, who began to encircle us around, and Lieutenant Wilkinson, with the troops, had gained half a mile on the road. End quote. So the rest of Pike's crew were pretty far away, as these 3 became surrounded. Tensions began to run high. Pike writes further, quote, the Indian demanded a knife before he would give it up, but as we refused to give any, the chief took one from his belt and gave him, took the dirk and presented it to the doctor, who immediately returned it to the chief as a present, and desired Baronet, that's Vasquez the interpreter, and desired Baronet to inform him he now saw it was not the value of the article, but the act we despise, and then galloped off. End quote. So it was another tense, impossible, violent altercation, but it had been avoided. After they galloped off, the Americans came across a herd of elk, which they immediately began hunting. The Pawnees, who had been watching, according to Pike, quote, immediately mounted 50 or 60 young men and joined in the pursuit. Then, for the first time in my life, I saw animals slaughtered by the true savages, with their original weapons, bows and arrows. They buried the arrow up to the plume in the animal. End quote. After the hunt, the men took some of the meat and then caught back up with Wilkinson and the rest of the party. I'm sure Pike was glad to be rid of the Pawnees, although he wasn't done yet. For on that very night, 2 starving Pawnees who hadn't eaten for days and who had just been forced to abandon their sick companion in the wilderness, they stumbled into camp at night. Pike writes of yet another tense Pawnee moment. When they were coming into camp, the sentinel challenged, it being dark. They immediately, on seeing him bring his piece to the charge, or raise his gun up, they immediately supposing he was about to fire on them, advanced to give him their hands. He, however, not well discerning their motions, was on the point of firing, but being a cool, collected little fellow, called out that there were 2 Indians advancing on him and asking if he should fire. This brought out the guard, when the poor affrighted savages were brought into camp, very much alarmed, for they had not heard of a white man's being within their country, and thought they were entering one of the camps of their own people. End quote. Yet another tense moment where tragedy was avoided, thankfully. Pike and his men gave these 2 hungry Pawnees some meat and corn and then sent some with them as they left to go grab their abandoned sick friend. They continued to travel on the Spanish path until October 12th. They'd had 5 good days of following the trail, but they now discovered a buffalo herd had stomped through it and had eradicated it. Pike called this turn of luck a quote-unquote mortifying stroke. Also on that day, 2 Osage told Pike they didn't want to go any further west as it was too far from their lands, so Pike bid them farewell. So now there were only 1 man and 1 woman who were Osage that continued along with them. Before nightfall, they got lucky, and as they traveled south, they again came to the Spaniards' trail. The going had been relatively easy so far with water and wood, but how long could they keep it up? They weren't on the Llano Estacado, but the Great Plains is a harsh land, and they were about to find that out. On the morning of the 15th of October, they again lost the Spanish trail on account of marshy ponds being everywhere. It had rained quite a bit the previous couple of days, so I imagine buffalo wallow ponds had filled and obscured the trail. They had even attempted to, but failed to kill buffalo the previous day, so I imagine these were buffalo wallow ponds that were mixed in with the already marshy area. This place that he was at now is known as Cheyenne Bottoms in central Kansas. It is just north of the Arkansas River's northern part of its Big Bend. The Arkansas leaves the Rockies and travels pretty steadily southeast until about a third of the way into Kansas, when it turns sharply northeast. It goes that direction for a bit before turning again rather sharply southeast. It keeps up that direction pretty much until it reaches the Mississippi. So at least they were about to find the Arkansas River. But they hadn't found it yet, and they had no idea it was as close to them as it was. When they came across a large creek, known to us as Walnut Creek, Pike decided that he and the doctor were going to go explore it for just a little bit, in the hopes of finding again the Spanish trail. Pike then pointed across the horizon to a thicket of trees and told Wilkinson to take everyone over there for the evening's camp while he explored. After quite some time, though, Pike and the doc were unsuccessful, so they were forced to head to the thicket of trees where they found not a soul. Their entire party was not where they were supposed to be. They searched for a bit before giving up and bedding down for the night in the thicket. But at least they had killed a buffalo and, quote, supped on one of our buffalo tongues, end quote. I have not had buffalo tongue yet, but I have heard it's pretty good. Well, 2 whole days went by without any signs of their party. They searched everywhere. They went back to their dead buffalo to grab some more meat, but they were swarming with wolves, so they killed 2 more buffalo. But Pike mentions in the journal that by now, he, quote, began to be seriously alarmed for their safety, end quote, meaning the safety of the party that is missing. The 17th, as they were searching for their friends and comrades, a cold and very hard rain and a cold northwest wind battered them along the way. He wrote that night, quote, our sensations now became excruciating, not only for their personal safety, but the fear of the failure of the national objects intended to be accomplished by the expedition. And our own situation was not the most agreeable, not having more than 4 rounds of ammunition each, and 400 miles in the nearest direction from the first civilized inhabitant." End quote. He then concludes that day's journal entry by saying that the following day, if they could not find their friends, they were going to go find the Arkansas and follow it in the hopes of finding him. But he remarks, quote, "if not cut off by the savages." End quote. Well, thankfully on the 18th, 2 of Pike's men rode up and told them not to worry. They were camped on the Arkansas River, and they were fine. And in fact, they'd been worried about he and the doctor for days. Wilkinson would even remark that he thought they'd been murdered by Pawnees. Pike was surprised at hearing that they were on the river. As I mentioned earlier, they had no idea they had been so close to the Arkansas the whole time. He wrote, quote, "This surprised us very much as we had no conception of that river being so near." End quote. When Pike finally reaches the river, he was shocked at how wide it was, although it was very shallow. It was filling fast. When Wilkinson and them had arrived, it had only 6 inches of water in it, and it was about 20 feet wide. But by the time Pike and the doc arrived, it had 4 feet of water, and it was 450 yards from bank to bank. Again, it is crazy how much wild rivers can change in just a few days. There's some interesting things to note right now, though, about how much Zeb and Wilkinson knew of the geography of the West. I talked about the Humboldt map that Zeb had copied and also added a few things onto. I talked about that in the last episode, but now we learn that Wilkinson must have the same or another copy of the Humboldt map, no doubt given to him by his father. Wilkinson will write to his father on the banks of the Arkansas, and he will explain to him that if Pike and the doc don't come back, he's going to go straight south to the Red River and take it all the way back to Natchitoches. But Pike did return, and the water level rose. So Wilkinson is now going to take the Arkansas from this point back to Natchitoches. Pike, on the other hand, he also wrote General Wilkinson, and he told him that he was now going to find the headwaters of the Arkansas, and then he's going to go over to the headwaters of the Red River to the east of the mountains, and then take the Red River back. He knows, because of his map, exactly where the headwaters of the Red River are. They are east of the mountains. This is important because if we're assuming Pike and Wilkinson have the same rather accurate map, then there's no way in a few months does Zeb get, air quotes, lost, and oops, I stumbled into New Mexico. Could you please take me to your leader? There's just something to keep in mind, because again, as I laid out in the previous episode, Zeb Pike knows the game, and he knows he's supposed to infiltrate into New Mexico, get arrested, get escorted throughout the territory, and then hopefully be escorted back to the States, or the U.S. territory at least, where he will be debriefed about everything he will see and witness. Because although it does not happen now, there was fear that the U.S. and Spain were going to go to war. And if that were the case, Zeb's mission will be paramount to the invasion of New Spain. Later that day, on the 18th, Zeb and the doc crossed the river because they wanted to find some trees big and good enough to make a canoe out of. Wilkinson had given up on making a canoe when the water was only inches, but it was rising rapidly, so now taking boats was in play. On that day, they found at least one tree. Of course, that night, it began to rain, yet again. When they awoke on the 19th of October, they noticed the river was continuing to rise, so they figured they'd better cross to the other side where there were even more trees. So that's what they did before, quote, preparing our tools and arms for labor, end quote. So they were going to have to make 2 canoes to take down to the Mississippi. On Monday the 20th, I don't even want to tell this story, but they had another shooting competition. The winner would receive a tent and a pair of shoes, but unfortunately during the excitement, a dog they had with them was laying in the grass under a tree when, quote, one of the balls struck him on the head and killed him, end quote. So far, their only casualties had been 2 dogs. If there's a Does the Dog Die for podcasts, this series is certainly in it, unfortunately. Over the next 8 days, they killed buffalo, one of which took 19 balls to take down. They killed prairie dogs, or as Pike called them, Wishton wishes. They killed 9 rattlers. They looked for trees for canoes. They looked for the Spanish Trail. They observed the Sabbath, wrote letters, built a skin canoe out of buffalo and elk hides, and finished 1 wooden canoe. They only found 1 tree worthy enough to make a canoe out of. So again, not everyone was returning back east, although a lot of them were. Wilkinson was going along with 3 men and 1 Osage in his canoe, the hide canoe, and 1 soldier, 1 Osage, and all their baggage was going in the wooden canoe. Another soldier would be following them on shore. Yeah, I hope they trade off. Either sitting or walking for that long would get tiring. Although this would not be an issue, it turns out. Pike and Wilkinson parted ways on the 28th of October after breakfast with a "God bless you" from both parties. Meanwhile, Pike had sent a dozen of his men to follow the river. So after Wilkinson left, Pike, Doc Robinson, 1 soldier, and Vasquez crossed the river on their horses and went to catch up with the rest of the men who were going up river. So how did Wilkinson's journey go? So they made it in the boats about 100 yards before both canoes struck ground. They then dragged the canoes for 5 freaking miles along the shore before they called it a day. The following day, the temperatures plunged, the river froze, and it snowed the entire day. By Halloween, the river was still frozen, so they abandoned the canoes only 5 miles from where they were so delicately made. They also abandoned their provisions. They decided to carry 6 tin cups of hard corn for each man, and they left the rest. Despite worrying about running into Pawnee, 'cause remember, Hardtrack and his rebel outlaw Pawnees had very recently been killing whites on the Arkansas River. But despite worrying about Pawnees attacking them, over the next 7 days they saw none. But they also didn't see any game to shoot either. Although that would change very shortly when Wilkinson recorded that they saw more game than they could count. He wrote, quote, "I do solemnly assert that if I saw one, I saw more than 9,000 buffaloes during the day's march." End quote. 17 days later, after 10 days of making them, they had 2 brand new canoes. They triumphantly set off down the river, and they grounded in a few hundred yards. This time, though, they decided to carry them. I mean, they've spent 20 days in total making canoes at this point. Might as well keep them. But I don't know if you understand how difficult and annoying and heavy it is to carry full canoes. I have done it. My friends and I wisened up, and we would later empty them, carry the goods across the land, and then carry the empty canoes before filling them back up again and doing it all over again at the next portage. It is annoying, but it's easier and way less painful. When Wilkinson and his party finally had water deep enough again, they set the canoes in the water, and the canoe with all their meat and ammunition tipped over. They lost it all. Eventually, they would run into the Osage and Tuckasegee, the aforementioned chief. He would give Wilkinson a horse and then ask Wilkinson to come visit him at his new camp about 20 miles from the river. When Wilkinson arrived, he noticed the chief was in a bad condition. The chief had edema, which causes you to swell. But when he arrived, Tuckasegee told Wilkinson that earlier, when the aforementioned Pierre Chateau, the Indian agent, he was the man Pike went back into camp to talk to. He was also the man Pike despised and Wilkinson's father called an impostor in all things and at heart our enemy. Well, this guy had visited with the chief after Pike had left, and he called the chief a child and a bad man. Pierre did. And then he told the chief, quote, "The Spaniards were going to war with America, and that in a short time they would claim all this country again." End quote. Now, this would have been early December 1806. Little did Terrestrial or Wilkinson Jr. know that his father, after he had been sent to Louisiana to take over all the troops, on November 5th, a month before being in Terrestrial's encampment, his father, General Wilkinson, and Lieutenant Colonel Simón de Herrera struck a deal that stated the territory between Arroyo Hondo and the Sabine River, this disputed territory. They made a deal that said it was now neutral ground. Neither country actually ratified this agreement, but both respected it. And with this arrangement, Wilkinson had avoided war between the United States and Spain. Well, Wilkinson and Herrera. And Herrera will come up again in the last episode when Pike meets him and really admires him. Eventually, this disputed territory would become part of the U.S. after the Adams-Onis Treaty in 1819, although it wouldn't be ratified for another 2 years in 1821. The same year, the short-lived Mexican Empire will win her independence from Spain. More on that later. So back to Terrestrial's tent. Wilkinson would stay there for 2 nights before heading back to the river, where he found huge sheets of ice floating downstream. That was no bother, though. He pushed off and they all floated with the ice anyways, at least until the river froze again. Wilkinson and crew were in a rough shape. Their clothing was in tatters and shredded to pieces. They were cold. They kept going with the ice, being grounded, dragging canoes. The river would freeze. They would wait and then float with the ice again. They would use axes to break the ice, and then they would ground their boats again. It was rough going. And by mid-December, the men had no shoes or socks or leggings. Many of them got frostbite from jumping in the freezing water all the time. On December 23rd, they arrived to an Osage village in a hailstorm, and then it started snowing. This village was the village of Big Track, the renegade Osage chief. At the village, Wilkinson read his father's orders to return to the Grand Osage village and cease your warring against the white man. Big Track nodded his head as it was interpreted, I'm sure, but ultimately he ignored the lieutenant and his general father. Finally, by January 6th, Wilkinson and crew had made it to Arkansas and the junction of the river with the same name as Mississippi. It had been a hellish journey. At this junction, a place called Arkansas Post, 4 of his 5 soldiers deserted. They wanted nothing more to do with the army or either Wilkinson. All of them were caught later and reassigned or given 50 lashes. Some of them were pardoned. It had been an incredibly grueling journey home, one that may have ultimately killed Wilkinson. He remained sickly for a long time, and he declined to go on another expedition in 1810. Then, during the War of 1812, he would die on an island off the coast of Alabama from an unknown illness, probably related to the expedition. Or it could be malaria. He was on the island to prevent the British from using it during the war that will take quite a few men's lives in this story. And if you thought all that was rough, just wait till you hear what Pike and his men are going through in the mountains, upriver, in the snow, in the winter. So let's get back to Zeb and his men in October of 1806. They had just sent Wilkinson's boats off, and they were heading up the Arkansas riverbank on the backs of horses, and they were looking for the Spanish Trail, aka the future Santa Fe Trail. And they found it. But then, on the evening of October 29th, as the snow fell, they lost it again. And on that day, they came across a couple neat things. They stumbled upon an Indian buffalo hunting camp which had painted rocks before they themselves killed the buffalo and ate the quote-unquote choice pieces. They also attempted to capture 2 wild horses, which were the first wild horses they'd come across. They were apparently just mixed in with the buffalo herd, just grazing alongside them. By Halloween of 1806, they were on the trail again and making good time, and they were also recording new discoveries along the way. It is curious. If his mission was to head to the top of the Arkansas River, why was he so insistent on following the Santa Fe Trail? He should be sticking to the river, not trying to get to Santa Fe, right? Well, we obviously know better. On the 1st of November, Pike records a nice story of seeing a herd of wild horses, which I will quote now. Dr. Robinson and Baronet, or Vasquez, accompanied me to go and view them. When within a quarter of a mile, they discovered us and came immediately up near us, making the earth tremble under them. This brought to my recollection a charge of cavalry. They stopped and gave us an opportunity to view them. Among them were some very beautiful bays, blacks and gray, and indeed of all colors. End quote. It sounds very pretty. The next day they would foolishly attempt to rope and wrangle some of these wild horses. They chased them on the prairie for 2 miles until they eventually lost 2 of their own horses, who ran off with the wild herd. Pike would write of this, quote, "I have since laughed at our folly for taking the wild horses in that manner. It is scarcely ever attempted, even with the fleetest horses and most experienced ropes." He then put in parentheses, "See my account of wild horses and the manner of taking them in my dissertations on the province of Texas." End quote. I have not read that. Maybe I will one day. On the 4th of November, while sticking to the river, they came upon an enormous number of buffalo, cows, and calves. He wrote, quote, "I do not think it an exaggeration to say there were 3,000 in one view." End quote. By now, they were near Dodge City, Kansas, that future buffalo hunting Wild West town, made famous by so many men, like Wyatt Earp and Bat Masterson. The following day didn't see much marching, but they did ride hard into a buffalo herd, splitting it in 2 and sending them every which way. They apparently, quote-unquote, covered the prairie with dust. Pike described it as a very pleasurable scene. Eventually, as they traveled northwest with the river, Pike gave up on describing the number of buffalo they were regularly encountering. "I will not attempt to describe the droves of animals we now saw on our route. Suffice it to say that the face of the prairie was covered with them, on each side of the river. Their numbers exceeded imagination." End quote. By November 9th, they'd found the Spanish Trail again, which was indeed not the mission, unless Pike wanted to get caught. They also found a camp along the trail that had been left by the expedition sent out to find Lewis and Clark, Malgares, the expedition that had come to the Pawnees. It's the same one that they had been following for weeks. At the camp, they discovered 96 fires, which Pike estimated meant that there were probably 600 or 700 troops and Indians in the party. He had 16 men. He also realized something important, which made him give up on continuing to follow the trail. He does not say this, of course, but he eventually realized, with all his delays, that the Spaniards were a good 5 or 6 weeks ahead of him. On his very detailed map, which had the number of days it would take to travel between each major spot, he realized that the return trip to Santa Fe from this place was less than 2 weeks. That meant the Spaniards had already returned to Santa Fe. All hopes of catching up to them and getting arrested were gone. He was going to have to become detained in a different manner. So continuing to follow the trail was fruitless at this point. It was time to ascend the Arkansas as instructed. As they headed west, the hills increased, the springs grew more numerous, the number and size of cottonwoods increased, and so did their fatigue. On the 12th, 2 of their horses gave out completely, so they set them free. But the day before, Pike made up his mind that even though they had no coats or blankets, and although winter was rapidly approaching, he decided he was going to complete his mission regardless. He wrote that he decided, quote, "to spare no pains to accomplish every object, even should it oblige me to spend another winter in the desert." End quote. He still had to meet with the Comanche, and he still had to find the headwaters of the Arkansas, not to mention his unstated goal of getting captured and escorted through Spanish territory. He had no idea that the war, by now, had been averted with the border agreement on the 5th. So he fatefully decided to push forth. And thankfully for us, he did. His coming adventures are going to be legendary. Before I lived in the mountains of New Mexico, as I do now, when I would annually travel to the American Southwest, my excitement would grow as I ascended the plains, just waiting for my first views of the Rocky Mountains. On I-40, you first see the Sangre de Cristos and Hermit's Peak about an hour before you're below South Mountain and east of the clearly visible Sandias. On I-76 in Colorado, I can't really remember, but I believe it's somewhere around Fort Morgan. But every time I would first see them, they would take my breath away, and I would give a rebel yell in the truck. I'm glad the feeling is mutual with Pike and his men. On the 15th of November, at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Pike got his first glimpse of the grand and gorgeous Rocky Mountains. He wrote, quote, "I thought I could distinguish a mountain to our right which appeared like a small blue cloud, viewed it with the spyglass, and was still more confirmed in my conjecture, yet only communicated it to Dr. Robinson, who was in front with me. But in half an hour they appeared in full view before us. When our small party arrived on the hill, they with one accord gave 3 cheers to the Mexican mountains." End quote. He describes them being large and white with snow, and he suggests they'd be a great boundary between New Mexico and Louisiana. He had no way of knowing that they would all soon be part of the United States. Unfortunately, he would not live long enough to see our victory against Mexico, a country that in 1806 didn't even exist yet. Around this time in the journal, he keeps mentioning that they are finding Spanish camps and that he is continuing to pursue them. The problem with that is the Spanish would not have come this way. They would not have continued up the Arkansas River after crossing it. There also wouldn't be Indian camps. They would know the difference. So the only explanation is that he's writing this for the benefit of his boss, General Wilkinson. He had a mission, yes, and he'd completed a good amount of it, but he still had yet to run into any Comanche. He also hadn't found the headwaters of the Arkansas, which he was attempting to do now. The only thing is, he was supposed to be home in time for Christmas, before winter. But the man wants to complete his job, which yes also included getting captured. So he's justifying his continued disobedience by saying he and his men were following some evidence. He did the same thing the previous year. He was supposed to be back before winter, but instead he continued up the Mississippi until he came very near to its headwaters. He no doubt got a scolding upon his return, so this time he's covering his bases. As they approached the mountains, Pike remarked at how, despite riding towards them, they did not appear any closer than they had the day before. He felt like he was walking on a treadmill, essentially. Geographers in the early 19th century, I did not know this, but they believed in something called continental symmetry. So when he first saw the enormous peaks, he figured they would be about the same size as the Appalachians. So he thought he'd be there at their base the following day. For almost a week, he thought he was going to be at the mountain's base the following day. When he continued to approach and they stayed just as far away, he began to suspect they were much larger than he originally thought, and he began to plan on the fact that there may not be a lot of game in those snow-covered mountains once they were reached. So Pike had the men kill a bunch of buffalo, which they dried 900 pounds of. This considerable weight slowed them and the horses, but at least they wouldn't starve during the winter, right? On November 22nd, the inevitable occurred. They ran into some Indians. Vasquez shouted at the men, "Voilà un sauvage!" It was not the Comanche, though. Instead, it was the Pawnees. And this was not going to be a pleasant interaction. As the men advanced towards the approaching Indians, Pike noticed the hills around them were also teeming with Pawnees, with the intent to surround them. But at least the ones approaching from the front had their weaponless arms extended. Pike mentions that Indians appeared nervous. So, to assuage their fears, he dismounted and began walking towards them. But as soon as he got off his horse, quote, A fellow had mounted him and was off. End quote. Someone had just stolen his horse, and then someone stole Vasquez's and the doctor's. But eventually, this war party of Pawnees, hell-bent on killing some Comanche, they eventually returned the horses to the Americans. When Pike learned that they had been unsuccessful in warring against the Comanche, he wrote, quote, "An unsuccessful war party on their return home are always ready to embrace an opportunity of gratifying their disappointed vengeance on the first persons whom they meet." End quote. Zeb could feel the tension, so he and his men went away from the 60 or so Pawnees, unloaded their stuff, dismounted, and again approached the war party. Pike remarked that half had guns and the rest had bows and arrows, and some had lances. The Indians were arranged in a circle when Pike sat down in the middle. The peace pipe was laid on the ground, although they did not touch it. Still, quote, "Thus far all was well," end quote. To pacify the war party, Pike gave them a bunch of tobacco, a dozen knives, 60 fire steels, and 60 flints. But this was not enough. The Pawnees demanded ammunition, corn, blankets, kettles, etc. But Pike wasn't handing over the equipment they desperately needed to survive the coming harsh winter. Pike notes that they still had yet to touch the peace pipe, quote, "as if they were undetermined whether to treat us as friends or enemies," end quote. Eventually, though, after a kettle of water and some food was passed around, the peace pipe was smoked. But then the trouble started. After the gifts Pike gave them were passed around, some of the war party threw them to the ground, by way of contempt, quote unquote. Sensing trouble, the Americans walked over to their horses and began loading them up again for their swift departure. But instead, they encircled them and, quote, "commenced stealing everything they could," end quote. Here's what he says of what unfolds. "Finding it was difficult to preserve my pistols, I mounted my horse, when I found myself frequently surrounded, during which some were endeavoring to steal the pistols. The doctor was equally engaged in another quarter, and all the soldiers in their positions. In taking things from them, one having stolen my tomahawk, I informed the chief, but he paid no respect except to reply that they were pitiful. Finding this, I determined to protect ourselves as far as was in my power, and the affair began to take a serious aspect. I, ordering my men to take their arms and separate themselves from the savages, at the same time declaring to them I would kill the first man who touched our baggage, on which they commenced filing off immediately. We marched about the same time and found they had made out to steal one sword, tomahawk, broad axe, 5 canteens, and sundry other small articles." End quote. So they made it out with their lives, but they lost some good and valuable equipment in the unnecessary fracas. Pike would write of it all, quote, "I felt myself sincerely mortified that the smallness of my number obliged me thus to submit to the insults of a lawless banditti, it being the first time ever a savage took anything from me with the least appearance of force." End quote. After they made camp, the Doc and Zeb walked back from whence they came and spied to see if anyone had pursued them to steal their horses overnight. But no Pawnee dared sneak up on them. It had been yet another tense and close scrape with the Pawnee. I'm positive he was hoping to never see them again. The following day, the 23rd of November, Pike incorrectly assumed that the headwaters of the Arkansas was a one-day's journey from the spot they found themselves in, which is near modern-day Pueblo, Colorado. He also took a look at what he called Blue Mountain, but what is now called, today, Pike's Peak. He looked at that 14er and also incorrectly assumed he could summit that bad boy in one day. On the 24th, they cut down a bunch of trees and made a 5-foot-high, 3-walled defensive breastwork with the open wall against the Arkansas River. This structure was the first building in all of Colorado history to fly the American flag. Although Zeb doesn't record that fact, but Hart and Holbert are quite confident that they would have flown the flag. And it's a good observation. This defensive breastwork would have been in downtown Pueblo on Santa Fe Avenue, which is quite fitting. Pike then assigned 12 men to stay behind, while he, Doc Robinson, and 2 privates headed to the base of the mountain, named after him now, and they expected to reach the base before nightfall. Instead, they spent a very cold and hungry night beneath a cedar tree out on the prairie. Pike's judgment of distance was a little lacking. He obviously had no idea how tall the mountains were, or he would have been more correct. Pike and Co. expected to summit Pike's Peak the following day, but instead they only made it to its base. On the 26th, quote, expecting to return to camp that evening, we left all our blankets and provisions at the foot of the mountain. End quote. Big mistake. They began climbing the mountain, but they found it, quote unquote, very difficult, and sometimes they had to climb nearly perpendicular rocks. They were totally unprepared for this side quest, really. The purpose of climbing it in the first place was to get a good view of the Arkansas River, to see where its headwaters were, or at least where it went. Little did they know that big old river goes west for another 150 some odd miles, deep into the Rockies. They slept that night on the mountain in a cave, cold and thirsty. They awoke on the 27th, quote, extremely sore from the inequality of the rocks on which we had lain all night, end quote. But as he remarks, at least the view was to die for. While they had a clear sky, below them it was snowing, and since they were above the clouds, he described it thusly. The unbounded prairie was overhung with clouds, which appeared like the ocean in a storm. Wave piled on wave and foaming, end quote. It's a very good description, and I use a very similar one in my upcoming novel when the main character is sitting on the roof of a chalet in the mountains west of Denver. And I promise I wrote my description before reading Zeb's journal. After an hour of climbing in waist-deep snow at 23 degrees Fahrenheit, they finally reached the top of Pike's Peak. Oh, wait, no. They'd ascended the wrong mountain. Modern historians believe he ascended Mount Rosa, and he realized it as well. He wrote, quote, the summit of the Grand Peak, which was entirely bare of vegetation and covered with snow, now appeared at the distance of 15 or 16 miles from us, and as high again as what we had ascended. End quote. He realized getting there would take a whole other day just to arrive at its base, let alone climbing that beast to the top. He looked it over and claimed that, quote, I believe no human being could have ascended to its pinnacle, end quote. It may have looked that way and felt that way after their arduous journey, but as of 2025, there have been probably around 25 million human beings that have climbed Pike's Peak. And a quick fact about the name. It was John C. Fremont who gave the mountain the moniker Pike's Peak. And it would stick on account of the Colorado Gold Rush, when miners hoping to strike it rich used the slogan Pike's Peak or bust. Actually, now that I think about it, Doc Robinson will make a map later in his life, and he will put, I think it was 1819, around there, and he will put Pike's Peak on that map. So maybe John C. Fremont read or owned a copy of Robinson's awesome map. This was not some trivial climb either. John Murphy, a Zeb Pike enthusiast in Colorado, he told the Denver Post that, quote, this was the first recorded climb of a mountain west of the Mississippi, and the first ascent into the Alpine Zone. That makes Pike the grandfather of Western American mountaineering, end quote. And for that, we salute he and his men. I'm not a mountaineer myself, and I think I'm too old to start, but I do love rock climbing. Pike also estimated that the peak was over 18,000 feet, but you can't fault him too much for that. His assumption that the prairie at the mountain's base was at 8,000 feet instead of 5,000, so he was off by only about 1,000 feet if you adjust for that. The mountain is actually 14,115 feet high. They descended the mountain with more ease than they had imagined, and finally they returned to their belongings, only to find that their food was destroyed. It then began to snow, so they slept under a projecting rock and finally had a meal of 1 partridge and a deer rib. It was the first time they'd eaten in 48 hours. On the 28th, the 4 of them made their way back to the others, but along their route, they passed many an abandoned Comanche camp and finally they had a proper bison meal. The 4 of them reunited on the 29th with the rest of the men. And then on the 30th and December 1st, they were all stuck in a horrendous snowstorm. And then the magpies descended. Now, I love magpies. I love seeing their white streaks on their black feathers. They are awesome-looking birds, but I know they can be brutal. And on the 1st of December, they showed this brutality by picking at the horses' sores on their backs to eat the flesh. It was pouring snow, and the horses were cold and scraped up from the riding, and then these birds were agonizing the beasts. Pike writes that they were so bold as to, quote, light on our men's arms and eat meat out of their hands, end quote. When they awoke on the 2nd, the snow had finally stopped. But it was -2 degrees. Then, as they crossed an icy river, 2 of his men got horrible frostbite on their feet. Eventually, a horse went crazy, or as he put it, got a freak in his head, and that horse ran off. So Pike sent 3 men to go fetch it, but they failed, and when they returned, one of them had their feet frozen. Bad frostbite. They would eventually get the horse back after a couple of days. They needed these horses. The weather was severely hampering their exploration. And as is evidenced by all of the frostbite, it was a difficult journey. And the terrain wasn't helping either. Hills, cliffs, harsh, rugged, and rocky, these are all terms Zeb uses in the journal to describe the land they were walking and riding through now. Not to mention, none of these men had winter clothing. As Zeb writes, quote, I had not calculated on being out in that inclement season of the year, end quote. That's putting it mildly. -2 degrees with no coats. Their clothes are all tattered and rugged. On the 5th of December, when Zeb was out scouting, he heard the report of 14 guns at the camp, which, quote unquote, alarmed me considerably. But thankfully, it was just the men shooting turkeys. The following day, Zeb and the doc explored the Arkansas River, which by now had both sides encased by 200-foot-high cliffs. Today, this area is known as Royal Gorge, and it is beautiful. The highway runs right alongside it, but way above it. The last time I drove through there, I saw a whitewater rafter thrown overboard. I zoomed out of view before I saw if they were pulled back up into the boat or not. I would very much like to fly fish. Not this section, but the Arkansas River in the Rockies. Actually, I did. In October of 24. But I had no idea what I was doing, and so I didn't even get a bite. I am much more experienced now. Over the next several days of Pike's journey, he sent a bunch of men out to find this mythical Spanish trail, but rather a reconnoitering trail. What he probably found, though, was a Comanche trail, since tens of thousands of them live in the area in the wintertime. He definitely did not find any Spanish trail, as he was calling it. On December 7th, in the Royal Gorge, Pike wrote in his journal that by the reports of his men and his own observation, he had found the headwaters of the Arkansas River. Technically, he was 80-some-odd miles short of that spot, but he had a more pressing mission now. He needed to follow the supposed Spanish trail south. He still needed to get himself captured. By the 11th, Pike was following this Spanish trail and remarking that the Spanish had camped here and there. He'd lose the trail and then find it again. But all of this is somewhat confusing because he's following the trail north of the Arkansas River, not south. Why on earth was he doing that? He isn't supposed to follow no Spanish trail. He was supposed to be heading towards the Red River to take it down to Natchitoches. So what on earth was he doing? Well, I will read George R. Matthews, because he sums up this questionable stretch of the journey. Headwaters of the Platte and Yellowstone Rivers, which he later indicated when he included the names of both rivers in the title of his book, on account of expeditions to the sources of the Arkansas, Cairns, La Platte, and Pierre Juan, Yellowstone, rivers. But an unanswerable question remains. Why did Pike continue the Spanish trail obsession, instead of simply admitting he wanted to find the headwaters of 2 more rivers? Seeking a Spanish trail going north from the Arkansas made him look foolish, while further exploration could only be viewed as courageous. End quote. So the man was an adventurer. He wanted fortune and glory. Maybe just glory. The whole party was continuing northwest for days, gaining elevation and becoming surrounded by 14ers, nearly on all sides. And they eventually camped in South Park, which itself is 10,000 feet up. They continued to discover supposed Spanish camps. And then finally, on the 13th, they encamped in some woods at the base of a mountain. Then, Pike went out and explored. He walked 2 miles before he found the Platte River, although he knew it was there on account of his detailed map. The Platte will head northeast from this spot as it spills out onto the plains. Highway 76 follows it until it meets up with the Missouri in Nebraska. Pike knows this too, as I'll mention in a moment. The 14th and 15th were busy journal entries. The men camped on the Platte after discovering a massive Comanche camp, and Pike estimated there were thousands of horses in that camp. They also busted another gun, which made 8 guns now out of commission. They would try to repair them here, though. They needed those guns. Pike remarks that one of his men was now only armed with Zeb's sword and pistols. He mentions that most of them are now almost naked and suffering from extreme cold. And importantly, he remarks that, quote, the geography of the country had turned out to be so different from our expectations, end quote. But that is not possible. Maybe for the other men, but Pike had the map. He knew exactly where he was and what was around him. He claims by now to be looking for the mouth of the Red River, which is nowhere near them. And he knows that. He knows it's to his southeast. But what he's really looking for, as his map points out, is the Rio Grande, which will take him directly to Santa Fe. But he can't write that down. His whole plan is to be taken by the Spanish, so he can't give away the game in his journal. He has to keep up this ruse that he is looking for the mouth of the Red River, or Yellowstone River, which he also claims to be searching. Now, Hart and Holbert declare that he is in fact looking for a Red River. They remind us that he had no nefariousness in mind when he was looking for the Colorado River, or Red River. Colorado means red in Spanish. But it seems they don't know that he has the map that we now know he had. H&H write vociferously that he was indeed lost, as his journal reiterates. H&H write, quote, what the present writer believes to have been the mistakes of previous editors in interpreting Pike's experiences from now on to his capture are due to failure properly to correlate his successive and perfectly logical series of geographical mistakes. End quote. But with his map that Wilkinson had given him, Pike knew exactly where he was and exactly where he was going. They were not a perfectly logical series of geographical mistakes. They were calculated. Here's George R. Matthews again, quote, there was method to Pike's apparent disorientation. He had conceived a strategy to pretend to be lost when confronted by Spanish troops and rely on their reputation for hospitality to receive an escort to Santa Fe. He had explained this plan 5 months earlier, in July, in a letter to Wilkinson. His map revealed his claim of being lost as a deception, as did a copy he had made of his letter to Wilkinson, which he carried with him. But Pike did not intend to share either the map or letter with the Spanish. He did, however, still plan to claim he had become lost, searching for the Red River. Consequently, Pike decided to bear our course southwest, for the head of Red River. End all quotes. The Red River was to the southeast. The Rio Grande was to the southwest. Pike knew this. He was not lost. This was his ticket to Santa Fe. This was his ticket to glory. Putting Pike's plan in action of finding the Red River to the southwest, aka the Rio Grande, on December 16th, they began to descend from this high area, but as they walked, they found an Indian camp, which had a giant cross in the center of it. Pike asks the reader if these Indians were Catholics. My answer is yeah, probably. With the French to the north and the Spanish to the south, it's a pretty safe bet. They left South Park using the Trout Creek Pass and descended a bit before they found a river on the 18th of December. Pike's men asked if this was the Red River, which Pike doubted. He knew it wasn't, and his men probably knew it wasn't as well. They were still above the Arkansas, so it is an impossibility for a river to cross another river without merging. He was just keeping up the ruse in the journal. But he eventually went exploring and decided to write in the journal that, you know what, now I also think it's the Red River. Again, he didn't think that. He knew it was not. But this river might lead to the Rio Grande, although he didn't write that part. Again, here editors H&H are fully on board with the Pike was just lost story. They write, quote, "We now have before us the development of Pike's misunderstandings of his surroundings. But because he once said in a spirit of youthful bravado that if he was captured he would pretend confusion as to his whereabouts, commentators and editors have surmised, in every tone of ridicule and unbelief, that Pike was consciously prevaricating in order to cover up his real purpose." End quote. They simply refused to believe that Pike's whole plan was to get captured, and even presented with evidence of his deception, they call it a spirit of youthful bravado. I am inclined to believe they have no idea he's got the map Wilkinson gave he and his son, but I don't know how that's possible. They mention the Humboldt map, but they don't mention that he owned a handwritten copy of it. Curiously, I learned in their editorializing that Humboldt would later criticize Pike for borrowing his map. Pike hadn't borrowed from it, he had a copy of it. Other than this just disbelief of Pike's actual mission, the editors are great at commenting on where he is at any given moment and some other important facts regarding the mission. By the 19th, a massive snowstorm had settled on the men, which bed them down for 2 days of unsuccessful hunting. Now Pike had a decision to make. He wanted to see this river's headwaters, but his men were suffering from want of food. So he decided to send everyone down the river while he and 2 of his men searched upriver. On the 21st, that's exactly what they did. The party led by the doctor and Vasquez departed south, while he and his 2 men walked for 2 days covering 25 miles. Eventually, they reached a high point, which let them see for 35 miles. He figured while gazing at the river valley that, yeah, he was probably near its headwaters. He'd later say he found the headwaters of the Yellowstone, but that is not possible. He was probably viewing the actual headwaters of the Arkansas. But he figured mission accomplished, and he and his men headed back downriver to meet up with the rest of the expedition. He was playing pretty fast and loose with geography here, but he still needed to get himself captured. Pike and his men would march hard until Christmas Eve, when they would finally run into Doc Robinson, who was out hunting. Pike and his men had only had a turkey and rabbit to eat, and that had been 2 days prior. So when they learned that some buffalo had been killed, they were relieved. By that Christmas Eve dinner, the meat from 8 buffalo had been gathered, and they ate around a big fire to celebrate the birth of our Lord. Christmas brought more snow and quite a bit of reflection in the journal, and I'm going to read that day's entry because it's pretty good. It being stormy weather and having meat to dry, I concluded to lie by this day. Here I must take the liberty of observing that in this situation the hardships and privations we underwent were on this day brought more fully to our mind, having been accustomed to some degree of relaxation and extra enjoyments. But here, 800 miles from the frontiers of our country, in the most inclement season of the year, not one person clothed for the winter, many without blankets, having been obliged to cut them up for socks. And now, laying down at night on the snow on wet ground, one side burning whilst the other was pierced with the cold wind. This was in part the situation of the party, whilst some were endeavoring to make a miserable substitute of raw buffalo hide for shoes. I will not speak of diet, as I conceive that to be beneath the serious consideration of a man on a voyage of such nature. We spent the day as agreeably as could be expected from men in our situation. Caught a bird, parakeet, of a new species, having made a trap for him. End quote. So things were pretty rough. They were cold, they were hungry, It was Christmas. They missed their home. The bird, by the way, is the now extinct Carolina parakeet. It is a very pretty bird, and it's a shame it's no longer with us. So, by Christmas, Pike and his men had traveled an impressive 1,700 miles. But again, it was a tough Christmas. But it was probably the first Christmas ever celebrated in Colorado by Americans. The following day didn't bring any relief either. On the 26th, several of his men came down with some sort of sickness. For their comfort, Pike and Robertson gave up the tent they'd been sharing, and they had to sleep out under the stars. Except there were no stars because it was still snowing. He wrote that they were, quote, completely covered with snow on top, end quote. On the 27th, their route out of the mountains along this river they'd found, it continued to be difficult for the men and for the horses, who, quote, received frequent falls and cut themselves considerably on the rocks, end quote. Oftentimes, the men had to take everything off their beasts of burden, carry it themselves, while leading the horses onward. They were at present following the Arkansas River, and they were near Salida, which is a very nice little town. My wife and I, as well as two friends, stayed in a little cabin across the street from the river in October of 24. And now that we have our little one, I would love to go back to that A-frame, spend the day on the river with the boy fishing. I love this whole area of southern Colorado. But essentially, and I'll make a map of his travels, but at Pueblo on the Front Range, they followed the Arkansas, got to the Royal Gorge near Canyon City, decided not to travel through that gorge, so they left the river and went straight north towards Cripple Creek. Once there, they headed northwest and got to South Park before traveling south until they hit the Arkansas River again. They then followed that river southeastward until they reached the Royal Gorge again, but from the other side. At Salida, though, where he is now suffering extreme cold and snow and everything, he should have headed straight south through Poncha Pass on modern-day 285. And then bam, he would have been in the San Luis Valley. Instead, he follows the Arkansas back to Canyon City before traveling south from there. So now he's on the other side of the Sangre de Cristos, which he will then travel over, and then he ends up in the San Luis Valley, just above the Great Sand Dunes. And you'll hear all of this shortly. And this was quite possibly the most difficult route he could have endeavored to take. At Salida, he saw no buffalo and no Indians, and he even thought to himself, this current path we're on, this cannot be the right one. He looks to the south towards Ponca Pass, and says, that must be where they leave the mountains to head south. But even knowing that, or suspecting that, he and his men continued following the Arkansas until they reached the Royal Gorge, where they camped on the 27th of December. Over the next 3 days, they walked with sleds through the Royal Gorge, only making 17 miles. The river was frozen, and it was a treacherous march. So much so that their sleds broke, and they frequently had to carry their loads by hand while crisscrossing the icy river. By the last day of 1806, December 31st, when the river abruptly turned northward, Pike wrote in his journal that he and his men now believed, for the first time, the river they were on was the Arkansas, which it was. The new year brought a slew of hardships. The river was frozen and icy and dangerous, and Pike mentions that many of their horses almost perished during this stretch of the 1st and 2nd of January. They attempted at one point to ascend the sheer cliffs in the gorge, but realized it was folly. So they quickly descended back to the river, but along the path, one of the horses fell and hurt itself so badly that Pike had to put it out of its misery. On the 2nd of January, they only traveled 1 mile. The following day, they lost 2 more horses. They, quote, became senseless from the bruises received on the rocks and were obliged to be left, end quote. The 4th of January was an exciting and dangerous day. By 3 p.m., they had gotten out of a section of the gorge and had made the prairie. Pike then sent Vasquez and 2 soldiers with some horses to find a way around the gorge and these mountains. He then divided the rest of the team into parties of 2 men each. He told each team to build a sled and take off in intervals down the icy gorge. He told them, if you kill an animal, take some meat for yourselves, and then leave the rest of the meat behind for the men following you to be able to eat. The men were hungry, and by now they were in a bad way. Pike himself determined to continue down the river alone. He was going to find 2 of his men that had left 2 days before to also look for a way out of the gorge and the mountains. Also missing were Doc Robinson and another soldier who had also been sent out ahead. So 4 of his men had been sent ahead previously, and he wanted to find them. Pike walked down the river for 5 more miles, and he said it was, quote, one continued fall through a narrow channel and immense cliffs on both sides, end quote. When night came, he arrived at a spot in the gorge where the rocks were, quote, perpendicular on both sides and no ice except a narrow border on the water, end quote. He began to worry. He was worrying about himself and the 4 men that were out ahead of him. That was the doc and a soldier and one of the sled teams who'd left before. As he searched for them, he found the sled team on the side of the cliff, and they were apparently trying to climb their way out. But Pike shouted for them to join him, and they climbed down and joined him. They also told him that they had not eaten in 2 whole days, and that night they were going to boil some deer skin they were wearing to eat. That's how bad they were. Pike does not write this, but I'm sure he told them not to worry, for that night he was going to go hunting. But before he went hunting, they all found the trail of the doctor on the ice in a slot canyon, and I'll let him describe it. We at length discovered a narrow ravine, where was the trace of the doctor and his companion. As the water had ran down it and frozen hard, it was one continued sheet of ice. We ascended it with the utmost difficulty and danger, loaded with the baggage. End quote. So we essentially ice climbed a frozen stream that was crashing down into the Arkansas River. And they were loaded down. When they'd finally made it out of the small frozen canyon, they discovered the campsite of the doctor, who must have stayed there the previous night. They chose to also make this their camping spot. In the camp, they discovered the carcass of an animal that Robinson must have killed, but by then there was no more meat. The doctor would later tell them they hung a large portion of meat in a nearby tree, but since they didn't discover it, the birds must have gotten to it. With no food and empty stomachs, Pike went out to hunt, but he had no luck. He shot the deer that he saw, but he only wounded it. And then he couldn't find the wounded animal, which really dampened his spirits. He wrote, quote, when I returned hungry, weary, and dry, and had only snow to supply the calls of nature, end quote. He meant to drink. The 5th of January had a rough start to the important day. Pike again went out hunting, and again he wounded several deer. At least this time he did kill one. And he was quite confused by this. If you'll recall, he had earlier won a marksmanship contest. He was a great shot. So what was going on with him missing these deer? Well, he would pretty quickly realize, quote, on examining my gun, discovered her bent, owing, as I suppose, to some fall on the ice or rocks, end quote. On his way back to camp and the starving men, he fell, and the bent gun completely fell apart. It broke, and he was deeply saddened by this. He probably was the best marksman of the party. So with his broken gun, he felt like he was letting everyone down. When he returned to the 2 starving men, he grabbed a double-barreled shotgun, and despite being sorely fatigued and hungry, he took off on another hunt. To get a lay of the land, he climbed to the top of a nearby mountain, and boom, to the east, he could see the entire Great Plains before him. It was then that he realized what I mentioned earlier. He wrote, quote, I immediately recognized it to be the outlet of the Arkansas, which we had left nearly 1 month since. This was a great mortification, but at the same time, I consoled myself with the knowledge I had acquired of the source of the La Platte and Arkansas rivers. End quote. So, oops, he wasn't on the Red River, which he knew, I suspect. but in fact he was on the Arkansas. But as he said, at least he discovered the headwaters of this river and the La Platte. He also mentions he discovered the headwaters of the Yellowstone River, but he had not. He was wrong about that one. Was this his plan all along? I believe it to be, and his future actions will bear this out. This is what author George R. Matthews writes in Thomas Jefferson's Agent for Empire. Quote, had Pike truly believed that the Royal Gorge was the source of the Arkansas and that he had been descending the Red River? It is unlikely. Even in winter, the gorge gives the impression that the river runs through it from a source somewhere beyond. It is much more likely that Pike planned to return to the Arkansas after exploring for the Platte and Yellowstone rivers, and then continue his journey toward Santa Fe. End quote. After he descended the mountain he'd just been on, and after he'd reached the river, he saw on the other side of the river Vasquez and the horses. The interpreter told Pike that they had found a good pass through this mess, and, "Oh, are y'all hungry? We've had a buffalo and some deer." They all then head back to the very same camp that they had occupied on the 10th of December. And at the camp, they saw signs of the dock. So, he did not return to his starving friends yet. He closes this day's entry with, quote, "This was my birthday, and most fervently did I hope never to pass another so miserably." End quote. Zeb had turned 28 on that day in 1807. On the morning of the 6th, he sent the 2 men who had been with Vasquez back for the 2 men he'd left the previous day while Vasquez went hunting. As Pike sat at camp, Doc Robinson and the man he had been with arrived and told Zeb of his trials. Apparently, as they were looking for a way out of the gorge, Doc Robinson had eaten some berries, which had made him sick, very sick. A lesson learned. 3 days later, on the 9th, everyone who'd been wandering the wilderness and that dreadful frozen gorge made their way to that twice-occupied camp. But at least in the end, they all made it back. And this spot was a literal feast for the men. The deer were plentiful, and they ate their strength back. Pike remarks that everyone was, quote, comparatively happy, notwithstanding the great mortifications I experienced in having been so egregiously deceived as to the Red River. End quote. Again, he knows exactly where the Red River was, and he knew he wasn't on it. This was for the benefit of the Spanish that will soon be escorting him through their territory. Pike then lays out his future plans in the journal. He felt that the horses were gone. They were worn out and they'd be useless going forward. He writes that they formulated plans, rejected them, had the most mature deliberation about them, until finally he decided, quote, to build a small place for defense and deposit and leave part of the baggage, horses, my interpreter, and 1 man, and with the balance, our packs of Indian presents, ammunition, tools, etc., on our back, cross the mountains on foot, find the Red River, and then send back a party to conduct their horses and baggage by the most eligible route we could discover. End quote. So he's leaving Vasquez and the horses, and he and the rest are going to take off on foot southwestward over some mountains to find the Red River, which doesn't make any sense. And he figures that by the time they find the Red River, he can send men back to go get Vasquez and the horses. By then, the horses will be well rested, and they would probably be useful again. And these mountains he's talking about are the Sangre de Cristos. He wants to go over them in winter, which would put him in the San Luis Valley, where he would then find the Red River. Except he knows that's not where the Red River is. But you know what is in the giant, haunted San Luis Valley? The Rio Grande, which will take him to Santa Fe. Here's George R. Matthews' take on why his journal is so geographically incorrect. There can be only one reason for Pike to knowingly make misleading geographical statements in his journal. He wanted future readers of the journal to believe he was searching for the Red River, when in fact he was knowingly headed straight for the Rio Grande. End quote. So after they formulated this plan, they began constructing the fortifications, they hunted, and they completed their scientific observations. And they did this for the next 4 days, Finally, on the 14th of January, 13 of them, including Pike, everyone except Vasquez the interpreter and one soldier, they headed pretty much straight southwest towards the Sangre de Cristos. They were going to hike up and over the mountains on foot in winter with 70 pounds of gear on everyone's back. Pike wanted to get apprehended by the Spanish and see the territory, yes, but in winter, going over the prairie for 700 miles by following either the Arkansas or the Red River would have been suicide. Just think about how difficult Wilkinson's return trip had been, and that'll give you a sense of the dangers facing Pike's men if they crossed that great ocean of grass in January and February. Santa Fe was the closest settlement, and therefore it was the safest bet, even though climbing over these mountains was going to be extremely difficult. They traveled for 50 miles on the first 3 days until snow stopped them. They were making good time thus far, though. On the 17th of January, the Great White Mountain appeared in front of the crew. These were the Sangre de Cristos. They'd seen them for a month now, looming in the distance to their south, but they were finally at their base, or close to it. The men found themselves in a prairie that had no wood or water, but Pike noticed towards the mountains were some woods, so he figured they could march over there and bed down for the night. Maybe they could even get some game in those wood, as they had not eaten in 2 days. But in the middle of this great prairie was a small creek, Grape Creek, and when they crossed it, quote, "Here we all got our feet wet," end quote. By the time they reached the wooded area, quote, "the night commenced extremely cold," end quote. Once they'd gotten fires going to warm themselves, Pike discovered that 9 of his men's feet were frozen solid. He wrote, "To add to the misfortune of both of those whom we called hunters among the number," end quote. It would get 10 below zero that night, and no one would get much sleep. That fateful water crossing is going to severely hamper their journey. The following morning, Pike and Doc Robinson, who were both spared frostbite, went out to hunt, but despite shooting a buffalo 3 times, it ran off. The 2 of them then bedded down for the evening, but they were so hungry and cold that they didn't sleep. This is the 3rd day without food and the 2nd night without sleep. On the 4th day without food, the 19th of January, Pike and the Doc crawled on their bellies in the snow for an entire mile just to sneak up on some buffalo. Unfortunately, despite shooting many of them mortally, they all fled the scene. Here, Pike writes, quote, "By this time I had become extremely weak and faint, being the 4th day since we had received sustenance, all of which we were marching hard, and the last night had scarcely closed our eyes to sleep." End quote. It got so bad. He and the Doc searched the area and found some woods because they, quote, "determined to remain absent and die by ourselves rather than to return to our camp and behold the misery of our poor lads." End quote. Things were getting truly dire, not just for these 2, but for the whole crew. Frostbite would take many of their feet later, and they most certainly were crazy with hunger and experiencing hypothermia, not to mention delirium from lack of sleep. But just when they decided to wander off alone and die, they spotted a herd of buffalo meandering their way. Pike mustered all the strength he could and ran to some cedar trees. When the buffalo passed, he shot one and it dropped. After 3 more shots, it was dead. Zeb and Doc immediately cut up as much as they could carry and began making their way back to camp. And then back at camp at midnight, when Pike arrived with his food, he threw his load onto the ground and, quote, "It was with difficulty I prevented myself from falling," end quote. He then writes, "I was attacked with a giddiness of the head, which lasted for some minutes," end quote. He writes how there wasn't a frown or drooping eye among the weary, cold, exhausted men, but instead they all seemed happy. This was, again, the first time in 4 days they'd had anything to eat. They were frozen solid, and they really hadn't slept. Curious as to what his men would do if he and the Doc did not return, his sergeant replied that the following day they were to send the strongest amongst them to find he in the dock and not return until he did, or until he shot something to eat for him. Tuesday, January 20th brought even more bad news. 2 of his men's feet were so badly frozen they were unable to walk, and he feared one of the men, his servant, a promising young man of 20, he was afraid he would end up losing his feet. 2 other men could only walk if they had no loads, and they used a stick or a crutch. Pike sent out the doc and some men to go retrieve the rest of the frozen buffalo meat, which they did. And then they did no marching that day as they recovered from the hunger and frostbite. At least those that could recover anyways. By now, Pike knew there was no way he could make it to Natchitoches, and then back in time to save the men. His only option now was to get to Santa Fe, which his map told him he could do in less than a week, if it weren't for this immense amount of very cold snow. On the following day, they hid the 4 loads of the men who couldn't walk with them, and then Pike went to the base of the mountains to see if they could pass. They could not. The snow was 4 or 5 feet deep. So they went south a little bit, and thankfully they found that they could cross at this spot, where the snow was much less deep. On the 22nd, he gave the 2 men who were unable to walk because of frostbite a ton of ammunition and most of the rest of the buffalo meat. He then, quote, made use of every argument in my power to encourage them to have fortitude, to resist their fate, and gave them assurances of my sending relief as soon as possible. We parted, but not without tears. End quote. So Pike and the rest of the men that could walk, they headed south for 8 miles before setting up camp on a little creek. It would be another night without food. On the 23rd, they walked another 8 miles, and towards the end of the march, it began to snow. Pike showed his sergeant a good place in some distant woods to make camp that evening, and then he and Doc Robinson went on ahead to hunt. But eventually the snow became a blizzard, and then a near whiteout. Pike could only see 10 yards ahead of him. He and Robinson split up to look for the others who weren't at the designated spot, but both gave up in the blinding snow, with Zeb remarking that being lost in a blizzard alone, he could, quote, scarcely conceive a more dreadful idea than remaining on the wild, where inevitable death must have ensued. End quote. So the 2, Zeb and the Doc, built a small structure out of pine to attempt to shield themselves, and then, quote, we lay down and strove to dissipate the idea of hunger and our misery by the thoughts of our far distant homes and relatives. End quote. Both Pike and the Doc are both married, and they both have children. So this must have been a trying time. They no doubt missed them very much. The blizzard dropped around 3 feet of snow that night, and then again the next morning. Zeb and Pike, they saw his men trudging through it towards them. When the snow had started, the sergeant had apparently instructed everyone to just bed down where they were. When Pike saw them, he wrote that they were all silent and with downcast countenances. Later that day, the 24th, as they ascended the mountains without having had any food, the lot of them had to stop when the snow got so deep it was impossible to proceed. Pike then looked east and again saw the great immensity of the plains, or the Great American Desert, as he will call it. He writes of this, quote, I again turned my face to the plain, and for the first time in the voyage found myself discouraged, and the first time I heard a man express himself in a seditious manner. End quote. Pike wasn't the only one discouraged. One of his men had said that it was more than human nature could bear to march 3 days without sustenance, through snows 3 feet deep, and carry burthens only fit for horses, etc., etc. End quote. Pike wrote that everyone was in a foul mood, and he understood the sentiment. So he decided not to reprimand him in this very moment. But instead he would wait for a more opportune time to address this man's seditious behavior. And that time will come soon enough. The men, quote, dragged our weary and emaciated limbs along until about 10 o'clock, end quote. Pike and the Doc then went on ahead in search of food, and to their surprise, a herd of buffalo was in the snow. They downed one, crawled to it, and shot from its carcass at 12 others, but they only got this one. And then they cut it up and began carrying the meat back to camp. After they joyfully ate the feast, Pike addressed the man who had complained, this man named Brown, and I will just quote the journal. Brown, you this day presumed to make use of language which was seditious and mutinous. I then passed it over, pitying your situation and attributing it to your distress, rather than your inclination, to sow discontent among the party. Had I reserved provisions for ourselves, whilst you were starving, had we been marching along light and at our ease whilst you were weighed down with your burden, then you would have had some pretext for your observations. But when we were equally hungry, weary, emaciated, and charged with burden, which I believe my natural strength is less able to bear than any man's in the party, when we are always foremost in breaking the road, reconnoitering, and the fatigues of the chase, it was the height of ingratitude in you to let an expression escape which was indicative of discontent. Your ready compliance and firm perseverance I had reason to expect, as the leader of men and my companions, in miseries and dangers. But your duty as a soldier called on your obedience to your officer and a prohibition of such language, which for this time I will pardon, but assure you, should it ever be repeated, by instant death I will revenge your ingratitude and punish your disobedience. I take this opportunity likewise to assure you, soldiers, generally of my thanks for obedience, perseverance, and ready contempt of every danger, which you have generally evinced. I assure you nothing shall be wanting on my part to procure you the rewards of our government and gratitude of your countrymen. End quote. So Pike essentially told the man, look, if I had a lighter load than y'all or hiked less than y'all, then maybe you'd have a reason to be so angry. But it's the opposite. I'm always hiking more, and I'm carrying just as much as y'all, even if my body is weaker than yours. So if you ever speak like that again, I'm going to kill you. But also, thank y'all for sticking with me. And this is going to be an adventure worth remembering by us and by our countrymen. That's pretty much what he said. And I think that that is the right course of action to take. With the lesson of marching without food learned, on the 25th, Pike sent out the doc and some soldiers to go kill more buffalo, which they did. They then spent the entire day in camp processing the meat. They were going to carry as much of it as they could, lest they, quote, become so weak as not to be able to hunt and, of course, have perished, end quote. Good plan. Probably should have done that already. They left camp minus one man on the 26th, and they traveled 14 miles, determined to cross the mountains. It was a bad day of marching, though. Through 3 feet of deep snow, they marched all day. But after finding a pass through the jagged Sangre de Cristos, they made it to the other side. This is Medano Pass, and it sits above 10,000 feet. On the other side, they found a creek, Medano Creek, the one that runs through the base of the great sand dunes. Well, when they came to the creek, Pike wrote that at last they'd found the headwaters of the Red River. But again, he knew it was not. But he had to continue to keep up the ruse, because he did expect that the Spanish would keep this journal and all of his papers, or at least read them and then return them. So he had to keep the ruse up the entire time. The 28th is one of my favorite days so far in the journal. After descending down a ravine on the western side of the Sangre de Cristos Mountains, they discovered a road with hieroglyphs on the trees. They then, after some marching, noticed on the other side of the expansive valley, the San Luis Valley, that there was yet another chain of mountains. These would be, my favorite, the San Juan Mountains. He then noticed, quote, near by at the foot of the White Mountains, Sangre de Cristos, which we were then descending, sandy hills, end quote. These, of course, are the great sand dunes of the San Luis Valley, the tallest dunes in the nation, and the dunes at the highest elevation. It is now a national park, and it's one of my favorite areas in the American Southwest, although at this time it was part of the Spanish Empire. Here is Pike's beautiful description of the great sand dunes. Quote, Their appearance was exactly that of the sea in a storm, except as to color." End quote. They finally were out of the mountains, but they kept the great sand dunes to their right until they camped for the evening, at which point, of course, as he always did, Pike climbed to the top of the tallest dune, either High Dune or Star Dune. And from there he, quote, "with my glass could discover a large river flowing nearly north by west and south by east, through the plain which came out of the third chain of mountains." End quote. That third chain is the San Juans. So what river is he describing? It is, obviously, the Rio Grande River. And he no doubt knew that, and he must have felt an immense amount of relief. On the 29th, they descended into the San Juan Valley in a direction towards the Rio Grande. But again, distances out here were far greater than Pike anticipated, so they only made it to a little wooded area after 17 miles of trekking. But on the 30th of January, they reached the actual banks of the Rio Grande, or as it was called then, the Rio del Norte. This would have been just north of present-day Alamosa. He writes about the Rio del Norte in parentheses in the journal, for appearance's sake. He wrote, "then supposed Red River." Again, he knew on account of his map exactly what river it was. January 31st saw them descend the river in the hopes of finding some woods by the river in order to, quote, "make transports to descend the river with, where we might establish a position that 4 or 5 might defend against the insolence, cupidity, and barbarity of the savages." End quote. The only quote-unquote savages they would run across at this time in 1807 were the Utes or the Apache, maybe the Comanche. And pray you were descended upon by the Utes. I should do a series on them someday, since I know very little of them. He also remarks that after they built their little fort or stockade, Pike would need to go send back for the other poor fellas that were left behind, all 3 of them. So they traveled 18 miles downriver until they came upon its confluence with the Conejos River, another favorite river of mine. At which point they cross the Rio Grande and ascend up the Conejos for about 5 miles, where they find their beautiful oasis of timber. The first 16 days of February are then spent in and around this camp. They build the stockade, raise the American flag over it, they hunt, they read, they study, Pike gets a refresher on French, and they do a little exploring. On the 5th, Zeb and Doc Robinson chase some deer until they ascend a hill, which shows them the entire San Luis Valley. He writes of it, quote, "It was at the same time one of the most sublime and beautiful inland prospects ever presented to the eyes of man." End quote. He guessed it was 60 miles by 45. The valley. He concluded his writing of the valley by saying, quote, "This view combined the sublime and beautiful. The great and lofty mountains covered with eternal snows seemed to surround the luxuriant vale, crowned with perennial flowers, like a terrestrial paradise, shut out from the view of man." End quote. It really is a gorgeous valley, and I love traveling through it, even though it's kind of dangerous and definitely haunted. It is important to remember that by now they had no horses, their ammo was running low, and the game they were hunting was moving away about a day's journey from the stockade. So why is Pike so sublime and calm in reading French in the Bible? Well, because he knows Santa Fe is so very close, and he and his men are going to be rescued, and he will get to accomplish his mission. But how is he going to be rescued? Aren't they building canoes? Well, that's certainly what he wrote. But in reality, he had a different plan. And on the 6th, Doc Robinson, quote, "having some pecuniary demands in the province of New Mexico, conceived this to be the most eligible point for him to go in." End quote. And pecuniary means relating to money. But Robinson had no financial interests in Santa Fe, although Pike did. If you'll recall, he had a debt collection notice against Baptiste Lalande. This Baptiste Lalande had a trading expedition to Santa Fe, but he never returned. He took trade goods down there belonging to the aforementioned William Morrison, Esquire, but he never came back with the funds. He apparently, according to Pike, quote, had land offered him and the womankind. He concluded to expatriate himself and convert the property of Morrison to his own benefit. End quote. Pike was then given this debt collection notice when he was about to sail off from the town of St. Charles. He'd been staying at Morrison's brother's house. And actually, I can't tell if he was given this collection notice in St. Charles or St. Louis. Regardless, if Pike's ultimate mission wasn't to reach Santa Fe, why did he have a document demanding money from a man now living in Santa Fe? Pike wrote that it was merely in case he ran into a Spaniard on the Red River. But we know better. Here is George R. Matthews again. Pike never directly confessed that Santa Fe had always been his destination, but the idea that he might present Morrison's claim to Spanish traders on the Red River and expect them to settle the land's financial obligations defies common sense business practices. And, while Pike always tried his best to conceal the clandestine objectives of his expedition, 3 years after the fact, while explaining the Morrison the land trading venture in his book, Pike revealed the true purpose of his journey, a military reconnaissance of New Mexico. Now he's quoting Pike. When on the frontiers, the idea suggested itself to us of making this claim a pretext for Robinson to visit Santa Fe. We therefore gave it the proper appearance, and he marched for that place. Pike did not describe what he meant by proper appearance. Perhaps Robinson's signature was added. But he was crystal clear why they wanted to go to Santa Fe. Pike again. Our views were to gain a knowledge of the country, the prospect of trade, military force, etc. End all quotes. On the 7th of February, Doc Robinson left the stockade for Santa Fe, ostensibly for financial reasons, but in reality, it was to alert the Spaniards so that they could come rescue his friends. But Pike writes a long and glowing paragraph, or testimonial, as he calls it, about Robinson, who had become, no doubt, his best friend by now. I mean, the men hunted together, explored together, went off to die together. They were brothers in arms, although Doc wasn't in the military. And they had become very close, as any two like-minded, brave, courageous, and adventurous men would during an adventure like this. It was their own private odyssey. I'll quote some of the highlights without saying quote-unquote and whatnot. He has had the benefit of a liberal education without having spent his time, as too many of our gentlemen do, in colleges. His soul could conceive great actions, and his hand was ready to achieve them. It may truly be said that nothing was above his genius, nor anything so minute that he conceived it entirely unworthy of consideration. As a gentleman, and companion in dangers, difficulties, and hardships, I, in particular, and the expedition, generally owe much to his exertions. And that's high praise coming from such a man as Zebulon Montgomery Pike, an American man I have grown to admire greatly. A man whose legacy became quickly overshadowed by Lewis and Clark, and ultimately the heroes of the Mexican-American War, and then the subsequent American Civil War. And it doesn't help that his name was tied to Wilkinson and Burr, but Pike had no knowledge of the Burr plot. Also that day, Pike sent 4 men back to gather the 3 beleaguered men and their baggage on the other side of the Sangre de Cristos. So they were to retrieve Vasquez and the man with him, the soldier, on the Arkansas River, and the guy who they left because his feet were frozen. Pike then wrote, quote, "This detachment left me with 4 men only, 2 of which had their feet frozen." End quote. It's curious how Pike and his men never made any canoes to float down the quote-unquote Red River with, right? Because that would have led him right back home. But Pike knew this was the Rio Grande, and it would indeed not take them home, but instead to the Gulf of America, eventually. The entire journey being in Spanish lands, by the way, and he knew that. Hence why, despite saying he's going to build canoes, he never does. He's going to wait there and be rescued by the Spanish, and then captured and then escorted. Finally, on the 16th of February, the Spanish, or at least one of them, along with a Puebloan warrior, appeared on horseback. Pike and one of his men were out hunting about 6 miles from their stockade when he, quote, "discovered 2 horsemen rising the summit of a hill about half a mile to our right. as my orders were to avoid giving alarm or offense to the Spanish government of New Mexico. I endeavored to avoid them at first, but when we attempted to retreat, they pursued us at full charge, flourishing their lances, and when we advanced, they would retire as fast as their horses could carry them." End quote. So they were playing this back and forth game of approaching and retreating repeatedly. And fed up with the game, Pike and his companion got into a small ravine and hid, hoping the two on horseback would approach in the hopes of discovering them. Pike writes that this works, and they allowed the two to get within 40 yards of them before they showed themselves, at which point the two on horseback were about to ride off again. So Pike ordered his man to lay down his weapon and to approach them. Meanwhile, Pike was, quote, "at the same time standing ready with my rifle to kill either who should lift an arm in a hostile manner." End quote. Pike then hollered at him in Spanish the only two Spanish words he knew: "Americans, friends, Americanos, amigos." Finally, the two men, one a Spanish dragoon and the other a quote-unquote civilized Indian, or a Puebloan, they finally carefully approached and told Pike that they'd been on the road 4 days looking for him. They'd been looking for him ever since Robinson showed up in town. They then informed him that Robinson had been received with great kindness by the governor. Pike kept up his ruse and told them, quote, that I was about to descend the river to Natchitoches, end quote, which would have been an impossibility with the Rio Grande, as it never goes to Louisiana. After a long meeting of sign language and broken sentences, in each other's languages probably, maybe a little bit of French, Pike and his men, quote, rose and bid them adieu, but they demanded where our camp was. And finding they were not about to leave us, I thought it most proper to take them with me, thinking we were on Red River, and of course in the territory claimed by the United States, end quote. That was for the benefit of the Spanish who were about to read his journals. So Pike led the two back to their fort, but the two men were much faster since they were on horseback. So when they reached the stockade, they, quote, were halted by the sentinel and immediately retreated much surprised, end quote. So they almost got shot. But Pike took them in, explained the situation, that he was on the Red River and was about to head to Natchitoches and all, but, quote, if Governor Alencastre would send out an officer with an interpreter who spoke French or English, I would do myself the pleasure to give His Excellency every reasonable satisfaction as to my intentions in coming on his frontiers, end quote. Curiously, these two men never told Pike he wasn't on the Red. That news would come later. But they probably didn't tell him because no one spoke each other's language. The two were surprised that Pike had no horses, and that he had such a small party. Recall how many men the Spanish had taken up to visit the Pawnee village? Yet here Pike was one of 5, although he did fail to mention the men he left and the men he sent back to retrieve them. The two spies, as Pike called them, they stayed the night and then left in the morning of February 17th. He then remarks in the journal that they stayed vigilant after the men left, in case the governor sent out Indians or Spanish soldiers to attack them. Later that evening, the corporal and 3 of the men he'd sent arrived and told him that 2 men would be arriving the following day, but 2 other men, Sparks and Doherty, with the severely frozen feet, were not about to walk. They weren't going to be on their way. The corporal told Pike, quote, they had hailed them with tears of joy and were in despair when they again left them, with the chance of never seeing them more. They sent on to me some of the bones taken out of their feet, and conjured me by all that was sacred not to leave them to perish far from the civilized world, end quote. Their feet were in such a shape that they could just pull out the frostbitten bones from their blackened skin. Gnarly. Pike then writes, quote, ah, little did they know my heart. If they could suspect me of conduct so ungenerous, no. Before they should be left, I would for months have carried the end of a litter in order to secure them, the happiness of once more seeing their native homes and being received in the bosom of a grateful country. End quote. In other words, he would never leave them to die. It would be another 10 days before the main force of Spaniards arrived, but that is for the next episode. In the meantime, the other 2 did in fact arrive on the 18th and on the 19th, Pike sent out the sergeant and one man to finally go get the interpreter, the man with him, and the two whose feet were worthless. Pike didn't actually assign the job, though. The two men volunteered. Pike remarks that, quote, the effect of habit, discipline, and example in the fact of two soldiers soliciting a command of more than 180 miles over two great ridges of mountains covered with snow, inhabited by bands of unknown savages who were in the interest of a nation, Spain, with whom we were not on the best understanding. And to perform this journey, each had about 10 pounds of venison. Only let me ask, what would our soldiers generally think on being ordered on such a tour, thus equipped? Yet those men volunteered it, with others, and were chosen for which they thought themselves highly honored. End quote. He really did have good soldiers with him. Pike pointed out a pass through the mountains that he believed would be easier than the one they took on the way in. This would be today's Mosca Pass. He then bid the men farewell, and he and two others continued to just walk the valley and explore. But they would head back to the fort the following day. On the 21st, Pike wrote how he was keeping his 4 men alert, both for Indians and for Spanish. For the next few days, they dug a moat around the fort. They studied. Pike set up sentinels on the hills to watch out for the Spanish. They killed deer. Pike and a man spent another night in the wilderness, which spooked the men back at the fort. Pike wrote, quote, our arrival dissipated the anxiety of the men, who began to be apprehensive we were taken or killed by some of the savages. End quote. And then, finally, on the 26th of February, 1807, Pike was alerted in the morning by the sound of his sentinel's gun. Immediately after the shot's echo subsided, 2 Frenchmen arrived to the stockade. They were in front of a large Spanish column. Pike had finally gotten his wish. He no longer had the threat of starvation or freezing to death out in the wilderness, nor would any of his men. And most importantly, he would finally be able to complete his clandestine mission of spying on the Spanish. In the next episode, Pike will be escorted at first to Santa Fe and then down to Old Mexico. He'd be escorted by soldiers of the Kingdom of Spain, thus fulfilling his secret plan to record the strengths and weaknesses of the Spanish Empire, which sat on the United States border. Thank y'all for listening, and I'll see you again soon in the American Southwest.
Came down from Alamosa, across the Rio Grande, to track a killer lion, lost his fear, man. First seen around El Rito, he laid a rancher down, killed the rancher's daughter, was gone out of sound. And the purple sage and caprock is never out of bounds when you chase the mighty lion behind slobber-headed hounds. Not much trace of man out here, the painted canyon walls, the ancient pagan hunters showed the chase and fall. Now the lever action rifle and horses changed the game, but their ghosts still hunt beside me, the chase still feels the same. And the purple sage and caprock is never out of bounds when you chase the mighty lion behind slobber-headed hounds. Now the hounds my father left me are ranging out of sight. I stand up in my saddle in the early morning light. I can see the good gyp circle, and I know it won't be long till the canyon rings are striking cry, the lion will be found. Purple sage and caprock is never out of bounds when you chase the mighty lion behind slobber-headed hounds. a lonely juniper to make his final stand. 3 faithful hounds lie dying, blood shining on the sand. And the good jib leaps up in the air, as low as murder charge. My rifle cracks, a whisper late, I can feel his iron jaw. The purple sage and caprock is never out of bounds when you chase the mighty lion behind slobber-headed hounds. Now the eagle sees us falling, the hunter and the prey. His shadow crosses lifeless bodies, where side by side we lay. And the good jib sits upon the rim, and all alone she cries a death song for her master, killed her mighty lion. And the purple sage and caprock is never out of bounds when you chase the mighty lion behind slobber-headed hounds. Yeah, the purple sage and caprock is never out of bounds when you chase the mighty lion behind slobber-headed